Okay, let me be quick then, and in 5 minutes, if I can, at 10 at most, give you the middle class story. Okay. So all of that movement, of course, reflects in growth amongst the vulnerable and the middle class. So this picture, in a sense, is the sort of flagship picture of the report. And in fact, we already thought so, but then The Economist magazine, when it picked up on the report, actually, they have those infographics on their website, and The Economist, the graphs move. So you sort of, you see these lines evolving, and they picked this one to summarize our report. And it is a remarkable graph, because here you've got the percentage of the population who were poor, vulnerable, and middle class over time. So now this is not mobility, there are no synthetic panels, this is cross sections. Okay? Looking at the cross section at PPP exchange rates with dollar inflation. And what you see is that, that magic year of 2003 that I've already referred to before, up until then, Latin America was mostly poor. There was, a bunch of vulnerable people, and the middle class was down here at 20%, basically. And from then onwards, there's a quite substantial change in which poverty falls from about 45 to 30, like we've seen before. The middle class grows from about a fifth to almost a third of the population, and the vulnerable continue to grow a little bit. So obviously, all of these things are contingent on the lines that we picked, and I try to justify the lines that we picked. But whichever way you look at it, there has been social change in Latin America in the last 10 years. And this is a period that looks different from this period, whichever way you look at it. Okay. Now, also, we use this graph when we're talking to the press in Latin America, to say, people would ask, is Latin America now a middle-class society? Our answer to that is not yet. It may be in the process of becoming a middle-class society, but for the moment, if anything, it's a vulnerable society. Okay. All right. Strong heterogeneity again. You can look at Argentina, Chile, and Uruguay at that end. So here the middle class is in yellow, the rich are in green, the vulnerable in red, and the poor in pink. Right? So Uruguay is the only country, actually, where more than 50% of the people are either middle class or rich, the only one. But, very substantial differences between these countries, possibly Costa Rica and Brazil nearby, and then El Salvador, Bolivia, and Honduras, where the middle class is still really, the way we call it, the continental middle class, the regional middle class, is still almost an elite still in those countries. Okay? So that, again, as you would expect, this is enormously highly correlated with GDP per capita. And it's correlated with GDP per capita for good reason. So here, again, in the motivation I showed you, I argued growth and inequality had a role to play. Now, as many of you will know, shares of population in certain parts of the distribution are mechanically determined by the mean and the Lorentz curve. Okay? So on the basis of that, there's a famous decomposition of poverty changes due to debt and rebellion. And we use that to decompose it for the middle class instead. So this is just going to tell you of the change, just statistically, shouldn't read any economics here really, just statistically, how much of it has to do with changes in the mean and how much of it has to do with changes in the distribution. Okay? And the green is the redistribution effect and the yellow is the growth effect. So a few things to say about this graph. First, there's much more yellow than green. In fact, about 74% of the growth of the middle class in terms of population density between 1995 and 2010 is attributed to that growth trend rather than to the redistribution. Okay? Second, that is not true everywhere. Look at two big countries here, Argentina and Brazil, where redistribution was a big chunk of this. Okay? Third, if I could do the same thing, and we do in the report, we present it right next to this, not for movement into the middle class, but for movement out of poverty. And there, that number, 74%, is closer to 50%, 55% or something, meaning that the redistribution did play a larger role in the reduction of poverty than it did here. One could optimistically take that to be a good indication about the targeting of policy. But actually, most of these processes of reduction of inequality have less to do with direct targeting of benefits and more to do with the labor market. So it's hard to be too sanguine. Anyway, that's descriptive. One of my co-authors, Jamele, got excited about this data set of the middle class he had and said, let's look at the BRICS. Let's not just look only at Latin America. So, these two graphs show middle class growth in this period in absolute numbers and as a percentage of the population, in Brazil in green, India in yellow, Russia in red, China in pink, and Latin America as a whole over here. Okay? So in millions of people, I like to think of this graph as, you know, airports have the fancy lounges, right? And then they have the regular place where you wait, right? The gate. This is about the gate areas of airports. Okay? These are not the elite, really. They're the middle class. But they are a good prediction of what you're going to see happening in airports as you fly out of Washington or New York or London or Paris. And I can tell you already that I hear so much Portuguese in airports than I used to. And I'm sure you'll be hearing a lot of Russian, okay? And the really interesting thing is, this is the growth in China's middle class by this $10 a day measure in millions of people. That is the percentage of the population. They have got a lot of people that they can put through this thing. So the airport effect will be there'll be a lot more Chinese people in your gate areas than there are today. And China will eventually catch up with Latin America in absolute numbers very quickly if these speeds keep up the way they are. Okay? So there are the transitions. In India, incidentally, that's not happening yet. I mean, the difference between China and India is dramatic in that regard. Okay. So that was numbers. Now a little bit on profiles of the middle class, and I'll be quick about this. So here, the colors are always going to be, I mean, I think the colors may vary, unfortunately. No, they don't. The colors are always the same. But going from left to right, poor, vulnerable, middle class, and elite. This is education, years of schooling of the head, years of schooling of individual. This is by individual. So as you'd expect, the middle class is somewhere between the two bottom classes and the rich. That's not surprising. This is female labor force participation, and you see that again. I was very interested by the case of Peru. There's either just a different way the survey question is asked or some measurement thing going on here, or there's something really interesting about labor force participation in Peru. It doesn't follow the same pattern in the other countries at all. But typically, women in higher social classes participate in the labor force more. Of course, that's endogenous. By earning money, they move their households into a higher position, right? But the association is clear. So, you know, women working are part of this process. And in fact, because we know, it's not in this graph, but we know female labor force participation has been increasing dramatically in Latin America. It is part of the reason for the growth in the middle class in Latin America, okay? More education, more female labor force participation go along with declining household size. Okay? Now here I don't have a picture over time. I have a comparison again across classes, poor, vulnerable, and middle class. You see that households are smaller in the upper classes. The poor have more children. If you did look at the dynamics, you'd see substantial declines in this. Look at this number. I find this amazing. The middle class, defined in this way, 10 to 50 in Brazil, okay, have fewer than 3 people on average in their households. Fewer than 3. Of course, that's an average that includes single pensioners and so on, but still, that's a remarkable number that wasn't there before. And amongst the poor, it's less than 4 now. If you had this in the 60s, it would be 7 or something. Okay. This I like. This is public versus private employment. Okay, so this is the share of people in each of these classes in these countries that are in public employment as a share of the total employment. Okay, so a number of things you can see. First of all, that in most countries, public employment is a luxury in the sense there are more rich people, a bigger fraction of the rich are in public employment than in other groups, with the exceptions of Mexico, Peru, and the Dominican Republic, where the middle class is slightly above, but those upper groups are always on top. Okay, that's one thing. The other thing, though, is that not only in this group, but in our whole set of countries for which we have this information, only one country, Honduras, only one country, and Costa Rica is just below, if I remember correctly, only one country, which is Honduras, has more than a quarter of the middle class in public employment. So although it is true that public employment is prevalent in the upper classes in Latin America, there are 2 myths about the occupational structure of the middle class in Latin America that get debunked here. One is that all of this Latin American middle class are dependent on the public sector. They're all public sector employees. That's not true. Okay? 3/4 of them everywhere, 3/4 or more, are in the private sector. Now, it's not on this graph, but the other myth is that this middle class is all entrepreneurial. They're all, starting their own businesses and pulling themselves up by their bootstraps. And there may be some of that, but the bulk of those 3/4 of the people who are not in public employment are in formal private sector employment, typically with larger firms. And this resonates a lot with what some Brazilian economists have told me, which is the story of the new Brazilian middle class is a story of formal employment. It's emprego com carteira, right? And that comes up in the numbers for a number of these countries. Now, obviously, I'm painting a broad picture, and there'll be heterogeneity. Okay, so